Hi everyone, welcome to this neurobox how-to session. Our how-to sessions are a deeper dive into topics and issues that we know our community are really interested in. My name's Donna and I'm your host today, and I'm joined by my colleague Mark Woodward from Neurobox. He is the head of occupational delivery. Hi Mark.
Hi, Donna.
Hi, thanks so much for doing this. I can't think of anyone better placed than you, Mark. We'll get started, I think. You're going to talk us through, you've got some slides to share, and then we'll take some questions at the end. So, Mark, it gives me great delight. Let's hang over to you and hear your words of
Wonderful.
wisdom.
Thank you. No pressure. um, Morning, everybody. Actually, I said morning. It's afternoon now, technically, but hi, everybody. For the next sort of hour or so, we're going to be having a look at workplace needs assessment and specifically, as we've said, sort of untangling them, a little bit of demystification, that type of thing. But before we jump into that, let me just introduce myself and also neurobox. Neurobox, as an organisation, we've been around for some years now. We work with organisations to help them support their team members and their staff, their employees, and we do that in a number of different ways, from working at an organisational level, looking at policies and so on, all the way down to working with individuals, doing workplace needs assessments, coaching, and of course that really important sort of middle level, working with people managers and team leaders. Myself, I've been in this space for, I want to say, about 10 years, but it's not. It's about 18 years now, which is quite scary. And in that time, I've sort of collected a few different hats. Workplace needs assessor is one of those hats, and that's what we're going to be taking a little bit of a deeper dive in today. Okay, so we're going to sort of look at a few different aspects of workplace needs assessments, and we're going to approach it from a sort of a frequently asked questions perspective, if you like. So we're going to look at actually what is a workplace needs assessment, the bigger picture type stuff. We're going to look at actually who a workplace needs assessment is relevant for. We're going to talk about reasonable adjustments and how they fit into this picture. Different types of workplace needs assessment, what an actual assessment looks like, and what you as individuals can do if you feel that you would benefit from a workplace needs assessment. So let's jump into this. First question is, what is a workplace needs assessment? Now, in order to answer that, I'm going to sort of zoom out a little bit and look at a slightly bigger picture and explain why we need a workplace needs assessment. Employers have a legal obligation under something called the Equality Act to make what we call reasonable adjustments for people with certain protected characteristics, and disability is one of those protected characteristics. And neurodiversity, regardless of how we feel about it, falls under the umbrella of disability. Okay, so an employer has to make reasonable adjustments for people with neuro differences or other disabilities. The challenge for employers is to know what adjustments exist. What adjustments should they be considering? Some may be quite obvious. Sometimes we can ask the employee and the employee may know. Sometimes the employee may not know. But the onus is still on the employer to make those adjustments. A workplace needs assessment is a way for an employer to make sure that they are considering all the adjustments that they should be thinking about. It's where an expert in that particular neurodifference or disability spends time with the employee, really understanding that employee's role, the expectations around that role, even down to what's included in performing that role, the type of equipment that's used, and so on and so forth. Understanding that individuals, as well as their challenges, but also the strengths as well. And then based on that conversation, the workplace assessor will provide a list of adjustments, suggestions for things that the employer could consider to make that employee more comfortable in their role, to support that person. But it's also a bit more than that. As I said, it's to explore how to support you as an employee to be your best self at work, to how you can best play to your strengths. And it's not just about looking at the stuff we struggle with. So that's what a workplace needs assessment is. It's that opportunity for an employer to understand how best to support that individual. Who can have a workplace needs assessment? So absolutely anybody who believes they meet the Equality Act's definition of disability can request reasonable adjustments. Okay. Now, whether or not the employee and the employer feel a workplace needs assessment is necessary is a conversation to have. It may well be that actually, as the employee, you know exactly what you need in order to be able to do your role, in which case probably a workplace needs assessment isn't needed. But for many, many people, it's not quite that simple. For many people, especially people who are new to the role, may not know what they need to work at their best. But essentially, if you meet the definition of disability, you are allowed to have reasonable adjustments. And a workplace needs assessment is a way of understanding what those reasonable adjustments may be. Now, what is the definition of disability under the Equality Act? The definition under the Equality Act is simply what we've got there. It is if you have a physical or mental impairment, and I can't think of any other type of impairment other than physical or mental, but anyway, there we go, a physical or mental impairment that has a substantial and long-term negative effect, obviously, on your ability to do normal daily stuff. Okay, so neuro differences fall under that physical or mental impairment, and it's really important to understand that nowhere in that definition does it say that you have to have a formal diagnosis. You do not need a formal diagnosis in order to meet this definition. Substantial is a really difficult one to pin down. You get definitions like I put there. Substantial means more than minor or trivial. Okay, I even looked up one definition of substantial in this context, and the definition that came back was not insubstantial, which was not really helpful. Substantial is often the more difficult element of this definition to pin down, but typically it means that if something takes much longer than it usually would do, then it's having a substantial effect on you. Okay. Long term is easier. Long term is, in this context, 12 months. So if an impairment, I love our medical language in this country, we love our impairments and disorders and deficits, but if an impairment is going to last or has lasted more than 12 months, it's considered long term. Now, obviously, neuro differences, we're born with our neuro differences and we'll die with our neuro differences, so they are going to be considered long term. Negative effect on our ability to do normal daily activities. Going to work, doing work stuff is considered normal daily activities. Okay, even if your job or your role is extremely specialized and quite niche, okay, if it's what you do on a normal day at work, it's considered a normal daily activity. So if you feel that you fit into that definition, then you are entitled to reasonable adjustments. Okay. We've talked about reasonable adjustments quite a lot so far, but what do we mean by reasonable adjustments? Because that's the whole point of a workplace needs assessment, okay? It's to help us understand what adjustments we can consider, we should be thinking about. But then we use the term reasonable adjustments as well. So what does all that mean? So I want to unpack this a little bit, okay? Because this is kind of the crux of the whole matter. So in terms of reasonable adjustments, let's take the adjustments part of that phrase first of all. So what adjustments should we be thinking about? As an employer, what adjustments should I be thinking about? Working practices, the way we do things. That's probably the biggest category of adjustments, if you like. Very often, the way that we do things and having slight tweaks and adjustments to that can make the biggest differences of all. And that can be anything from something as simple as perhaps having a slightly some flexibility around our brakes, for example, can make a really, really big difference. All the way through to having some additional time for certain things. Maybe perhaps having some consideration around how we perform tasks. All of those things fall under working practices. I'm just going to ask for your forgiveness for a second, because before we started this webinar, I made sure I plugged my laptop in so it wouldn't run out of battery. What I didn't do was make sure the plug was actually turned on. So just bear with me 1 second while I turn the plug on.
Mark, it happens to the best of us. We don't want you to run out of power. So yes, please do plug in.
There we go. Yes, I'm back and we
Brilliant.
are now working. So wonderful. Good.
I'm going to be really impressed now, Mark, if you can pick up your train of thought whilst we've juggled the tech problems. Go.
Oh, there we go. There we go. Great. So yes, working practices. So that's a really big category, okay? And adjustments around those sorts of things are very often the ones that make the biggest difference to us, okay? And often are probably some of the easiest ones to put in place as well. The other category of adjustments that we can think about are our environment, okay? Not just things like, for example, lighting, but things like, for example, where we're working, the position that we work in our office, what's going on around us. Most of the time, many people spend some time working from home, okay, and that's great because generally speaking, that means we've got a bit of control over our environment. Not always, but generally speaking. So the environment is quite a big area to look at. And as I said, it can cover absolutely everything from things like lighting, noise, even things like smell, other types of senses. Sometimes we've got control over that. Sometimes we work in an environment where actually we have very little control over it. Equipment, another really big area. Equipment can be absolutely anything from headphones through to sit-stand desks, through to sort of specialised equipment that we might use. It can even be things like very specialised equipment for example, people with hearing loss, for example. Okay, again, a really big area of adjustments to consider. Assistive technology too is a massive area of things to consider. So, for example, I'm dyslexic. I find typing quite challenging. Converting what's in my head into words is really hard work, but I find it much easier to be able to speak what I want. So having dictation software is a really, really great tool for me. For other people, having software that can read things out to them, for example. We live in a world now where actually there's all sorts of technology available to support us. We've even got things like artificial intelligence now that can almost act as our own personal assistants and perform tasks for us. I can literally ask my artificial intelligence assistant to look at all my emails from yesterday and tell me which ones still need to be replied to. And it will do that. Assistive technology is a really massive field and it's evolving all the time as well. And actually, from an employer's point of view and also from an individual's point of view, it can be really hard to keep up with this stuff. The equipment, the assistive technology is changing all the time. So actually, it's a really big ask to expect employers to be across all of this. And again, that's where a workplace needs assessment can really, really support in that area, because the assessor will be across all this. They will be an expert in all of these different types of equipment and technology. Training is a really key part of this too, especially if we're talking about equipment and assistive technology, because essentially these are tools. They're specialized tools that we're going to use to help us in our role. And like any tool, we need to understand how it works. But not just how it works, we also need to understand how we can use it best in our situation to support us. So specialized training, again, in those tools is really, really important. Awareness training is really, really key as well, because a lot of the support that we might need is also going to be coming from outside of ourselves as well. So helping other people to understand how we work best is also a really powerful adjustment too. And that's awareness training. And awareness training can cover all sorts of things, from straightforward training about a very specific neurodifference, for example, ADHD, or it can be more general awareness training, or it can be awareness training that's specifically designed for certain people, for example, managers, people leaders, that type of thing. So awareness training is a really key element of this. Coaching is another really important area as well. Okay, so coaching in this context as an adjustment would be where the employee spends time with a qualified coach who is also an expert in neurodiversity. And the idea of this coaching is that the coach and the employee, they work together, they collaborate to create strategies, ways of working to support that person in their specific role. Okay, so the strategies, the ways of working that are created are tailored specifically for that individual, for their strengths, for their challenges, and for their role. And it's a really powerful intervention, especially for people with neurodiversity. Speaking as a coach, I'm particularly passionate about this subject, but I've seen how useful it can be. There are many, many areas of adjustments. That's probably the most common ones, but as you can imagine, it's going to be extremely dependent on that person's role and their situation. But what's important is that we look holistically at the situation. We look at all areas of a person's role, of their environment, and then we consider adjustments in that holistic sense, if that makes sense. Good. Okay, so moving on, that's what we mean by adjustments. But what do we mean by reasonable? Who gets to choose, who gets to decide whether a particular adjustment is reasonable or not? Because don't forget, the employer is obligated to make reasonable adjustments. And the workplace needs assessment is there to make sure, to support the employer, to make sure that they are considering all the sorts of adjustments that they should be. What the workplace needs assessment won't do is tell the employer which ones of those are reasonable or not. Okay. Now, as a workplace needs assessor, I'm never going to make recommendations or suggestions for things that I knowingly know are not going to be reasonable. But I'm probably going to spend a couple of hours with the employee. That's not enough time for me to get a really in-depth understanding of that organization. So I'm probably not best placed to make that decision around whether something is reasonable or not. That's always going to be down to the employer. Okay. The assessment, the workplace needs assessment, is going to, or should, make sure that the employer gets a chance to consider all of the adjustments that they should be. So in answer to this question, who decides what's reasonable or not? Ultimately, it's the employer. Okay. But how do they decide what's reasonable? What's the definition of reasonable? And this is really, really challenging, and it's really quite scary as well for employers too, because there isn't anybody or any organization that will tell the employer whether something is reasonable or not. It's a very subjective decision. And the reality is that the only time an employer will be told whether or not their decision around reasonable or not was correct is if they find themselves in an employment tribunal. That said, there are a few filters, if you like, a few questions that we can apply to an adjustment to help decide whether or not it may be considered reasonable. And those are these four things that I've put on this slide. So probably the first filter, if you like, that we put through an adjustment, or that we put an adjustment through, I should say, is how important is this adjustment to this individual? How much of a difference is it going to make? Is it the difference between perhaps making one aspect of their role a little bit easier? Or is it the difference between them being able to do their job and not? How important is this adjustment? The second question is how practical is it going to be to do this? Okay, and practicality can consider all sorts of things through to, let's say, for example, a piece of software, through to the practicalities of actually the organization's IT infrastructure being able to support that piece of software. Does that piece of software require certain data protection requirements that aren't in line with the businesses? So, for example, a really sort of good example of this is a piece of software called Grammarly, for example. Now, that piece of software is brilliant. It's much more than just a spell checker. It can rewrite things for me. And that's great. As someone who's dyslexic, that's a really powerful tool, because what it means is that I can just write or even dictate what I want to say without worrying too much about things like structure. And then once I've done that, I can call Grammarly up and I can say to Grammarly, please take what I've written and rewrite it in a much more professional way. And Grammarly will do that. The way Grammarly does that is it takes my words and it sends them off to a really powerful computer somewhere else in the world. In this case, it will be in the States. Those computers work on my words and send them back to me. That's fantastic. However, if as an organization, your clients demand that their data stay within the European Union or even within the UK and don't leave that space, that means as an organisation I can't use Grammarly. because it's sending the information out of that space. So that might be a practical consideration. Now, it would be right for the organisation to question that and go, okay, fine, well, just because that's a rule, is it a sensible rule? Is it a reasonable rule? Is there a reason that we can't send it outside of the UK? And if the answer to that is yes, our clients demand that, they require that, then yeah, okay, that is actually a valid reason. But these are the sorts of things we need to consider around practicality. Another example of practicality may be if someone's requesting flexible starting times. So actually, I don't really know if I can always arrive at 9 o'clock. Let's say, for example, that I'm autistic, and sometimes the rush hour bus or train that I have to catch is just too overwhelming for me. I find that I can't actually manage that journey and still arrive at work in a state of mind where I'm not overwhelmed. So sometimes I have to catch the next bus or the bus after, which means sometimes I might not get to work until 20 past 9. Okay, might be perfectly reasonable in many, many situations. But if that person, as part of their role, is to unlock the office so that everybody else can get in, that might be impractical. So these are all the sorts of things that an organisation must consider when they look at how practical would it be to implement. The next question that we can apply is how affordable is it? And I've purposely not said how much does it cost, because that's not relevant. What is relevant is how affordable is it? And the idea being that it's much more affordable for larger companies. So the larger the organisation, the higher that bar is set, if you like. And the other consideration that we have to also take into account on this question is that in this country, we are lucky enough to have an access to work fund. Access to work exists to help employers with the cost of reasonable adjustments. So again, with that in mind, that affordability bar is quite high. Okay. The final question, or filter if you like, is this adjustment going to impact anybody's health and safety? Health and safety kind of trumps everything. And if the answer to that question is yes, it's quite likely that that adjustment is going to be considered unreasonable. Okay. Now, those 4 questions are not going to give you a definitive answer because this is always going to be a subjective decision, but they give a good place to start. They give some kind of a structure to think about this question of reasonableness. But it is a really difficult question. And many organisations, employers tend to struggle with this as well. Now, fortunately, in the vast majority of cases, most adjustments don't even come close to these questions. Most adjustments are actually relatively easy to implement and relatively straightforward, and sometimes the smallest of things can make the biggest of differences. It can even be something as simple as just having some additional time for a certain task, or being able to control the lighting in the office. Okay, most of the time the adjustments that make the difference are not going to come anywhere near this. And also what's interesting is that, again, most of the time the adjustments themselves are not the difficult part of this. The difficult part for most organisations is creating an environment, creating a space where people feel safe enough to actually ask for these adjustments in the first place. Okay, that's the challenge. Very often people don't feel safe asking for these adjustments, until they have no choice. For example, they may be on a performance improvement plan and feel that actually they kind of have to share their difficulties now. If we can create an environment where people feel comfortable asking for support early on, then the whole process becomes a lot easier. A workplace needs assessment can be carried out early on. Adjustments can be put in place. Very often the adjustments themselves are not the difficult part. So I don't want to scare people away with these questions and with this thinking and lots of talk about reasonableness and the Equality Act. They are realities, but often they are not the difficult part of this. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay. The next question that we get asked quite a lot is, are there different types of workplace needs assessment? And the answer is usually yes, there are a couple of different types of workplace needs assessment. Now, on one level, a workplace needs assessment can be as simple as a conversation between an employee and the employer, whether that's their manager or whatever. And that's always the best place to start. Okay, as an organization, we can be asking the employee if they've had any adjustments before. What did they find really useful previously? Sometimes that's the only conversation that needs to happen. As I said before, it might well be that the employee simply says, do you know what, if I could just have this piece of software that worked really well for me last time, then you know what, I'm good to go. And it can be that simple. But that conversation is only going to happen if the employee feels safe to have it in the first place. So as I said before, and I keep banging on about the difficult part of this whole process is creating that environment where people feel safe actually having this conversation. But sometimes it can be as simple as that. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes actually the individual, the employee may not know, especially if they're new to the job. They might not know what the job's going to mean for them, what's involved. They might not know how they're going to get on. Okay, the employer and the employee may recognize the fact that actually there may be things that we could do that neither of us know about. That's when we need a workplace needs assessment from an expert. And typically, there's a couple of different types. So there's something called a holistic workplace needs assessment. And they are typically delivered by organisations such as ourselves, neurobox, and others as well. And they are where a workplace needs assessor, who is an expert in that particular neurodifference or disability, will spend anywhere between an hour and a couple of hours, sometimes even longer than that, talking with the employee. And as I said before, really getting a good understanding of that individual's role. What specifically takes part on a day-to-day basis? What equipment are they using? What software are they using? What's the environment like? Where are they working from? Is there travel involved? All these different aspects of their role. Understanding that person's strengths and challenges. It's interesting because actually as a workplace needs assessor, sometimes I don't get to know why the workplace needs assessment is taking place. Is it because an individual has dyslexia? Is it because of some other reason? Very often we don't know that. And I've learned actually that although it is nice to know, it's actually not always that important, because ultimately we're there to understand where that individual needs some support. The reasons why they need that support are almost secondary. It may be because of dyslexia, or it may be because of autism, but actually that's not the important part. We're there to understand where they need support and to give some advice around how they might get that support. What types of adjustments might be considered to put that support in place. So that's a holistic workplace needs assessment. And as I've said before, a good assessment will look at all areas of support, from the environment, working practices, equipment, technology. It will look at everything. The other type of report assessment that can happen is through access to work, and I've mentioned access to work before. Access to work is it's a great scheme. We're one of the few countries in the world to have something like access to work. It's a government scheme that exists to help with the cost of reasonable adjustments, and they will provide funding and grants to employers to help pay for things like assistive technology, even things like travel to and from work as well. It will cover all sorts of things. There are some differences between an access to work assessment and let's call it a private assessment, a holistic assessment. Because access to work exists to provide support with the funding of assessment, of adjustments, the reports themselves tend to focus on just the adjustments which actually have a cost attached to them. So as an employer or an employee, my access to work report will suggest things like training, equipment, software, coaching, etc., etc. But it might not cover things like changes to working practices, perhaps flexibility around breaks, for example, because they're not going to have a cost attached to them. But as an employer, there is still an expectation that you will consider those for adjustments as well. Okay. So there are some slight differences between the two, but they tend to be the main types of access of workplace needs assessment. What's the next question? What does a workplace needs assessment look like? So actually, if I have requested an assessment or my employer has suggested a workplace needs assessment for me, what can I expect? What's that going to look like? Are there any tests? How does it work? So let's go through some of this. Now, typically, a workplace needs assessment will be a conversation between you as the employee and the assessor, usually carried out remotely, Teams or Zoom, that type of thing. However, it can be done in person as well, and sometimes there are really good reasons why it should be done in person. Sometimes the most challenging aspect of a role for a person may be the environment they're working in which case the assessor may need more of an understanding of the environment than they're going to get from a camera on a laptop. Okay. Workplace needs assessments can require some quite personal conversations. They can require a degree of vulnerability from the employee, because essentially we're talking about things that you need support with. So having somewhere that you feel safe enough to have those conversations is really, really important. Okay. An open office is probably not the best environment for that. So if it's going to be a remote conversation, Teams or Zoom, try and make sure that you've got somewhere quiet prepared, if you like. That may be having to book a meeting room, okay, or it may be just finding a quiet space to go. Again, if we're working from home, sometimes that makes it easier, sometimes it makes it harder. Okay. So yeah, having somewhere quiet, somewhere that you feel safe, having some vulnerable questions, conversations. But don't forget, you do have the option of asking for it to be in person as well. A question we get asked quite a lot is, does my manager need to be there? Okay, now the simple answer to that is no, your manager does not need to be there. Ultimately, what's important is that the assessor gets to understand your job from you and the sorts of challenges and areas that you need support with. However, that said, having a manager's perspective and input can be really useful as an assessor. Okay. For example, as an individual, an employee may feel that they are particularly rubbish at this aspect of their job, but actually the manager may have a completely different opinion. They may say, actually, I don't have a problem with you with that area. I think you're really good at that. But actually, where you could perhaps do with some support is in this area. So having that second sort of window on things can be really, really useful. Sometimes people feel really supported by their managers and actually want their manager present because perhaps their manager can explain the situation in a slightly different way. But of course, in the real world, there are many situations where a person might not want their manager to be there. So does your manager need to be there? No. Is it useful from an assessor's point of view to have a manager's input? Yes, definitely. How that's done can vary. Sometimes it might be a separate conversation with the manager. Sometimes the manager and the employee may agree that the manager will be present for 20 or 30 minutes and then disappear. Sometimes it could be as simple as a questionnaire for the manager to complete and send back. Okay. So yes, it really helps to make sure that we're, as an assessor, we're considering all areas of that job role, and that helps us to make sure that we're considering all appropriate adjustments. The next question is quite easy to answer. Will there be any tests? No, there are no tests, I promise. And actually the terminology we use is a little bit misleading as well, because when we use words like assessment, kind of implies that we are going to be assessed, which usually means tests. But a workplace needs assessment. There are no tests, okay? There are no questions around capability or performance. And there are certainly no questions around diagnoses. A workplace needs assessor is approaching the situation purely from how can we advise your employer to support you best. Hopefully that puts people's minds at rest. That's a question that comes up quite a lot. Okay, what other sorts of things can we look at when we talk about what an assessment might look like? How long will it last? Difficult question to answer because it's going to vary greatly. Depending on the individual's needs, depending on the role, depending on how comfortable that individual is talking about these things as well. Typically, 30 minutes to an hour and a half tends to be the norm, okay? But it's not unusual for some assessments to take a lot longer than an hour and a half. The important thing is that it takes as long as it needs to take and that you do not feel rushed and that you don't feel like the assessor is jumping to conclusions or has already made their mind up before they've got there because they happen to know that you're dyslexic. Okay, it needs to be an individual conversation about your particular set of circumstances. Now, if it is going to take a while, the assessor should make sure that you get as many breaks as you need, okay? Because sometimes these conversations can be emotionally quite draining and also mentally quite challenging as well sometimes because you're being asked a lot of the time to succinctly summarize things that aren't easy to summarize. What does your job look like? Well, the typical answer is, well, and it depends what day of the week we're on, quite honestly. And so having these conversations can be quite challenging and demanding. Do I need to do anything before the workplace needs assessment? Generally speaking, no, not really. It can help, obviously, knowing a little bit about what the assessment is there for and what it's going to be asking and asking of you it might help to spend a bit of time thinking about how you might describe your role to somebody. Spend a bit of time thinking about, well, actually, what does my day look like? But apart from making sure you've got somewhere that you feel comfortable having that conversation, doing the assessment, there isn't really anything else you need to do. So one of the things that we at neurobox do before an assessment is we'll send out 2 questionnaires. A questionnaire for you as the employee, and also a questionnaire for you to pass on to your manager as well. Okay, those questionnaires are typically just asking very sort of high level type questions around your role and your job, and why you've requested a workplace needs assessment. But they can be quite a valuable thing for the assessors to have beforehand, but they are not compulsory. We don't need them back. So we always say that if you're not comfortable completing them, if you're not comfortable passing them on to your manager, you don't need to. Okay. But other than that, generally the answer to do I need to do anything before the assessment is no. Do I need to bring anything along to the assessment? Okay. Again, generally speaking, the answer is no, you don't. Okay. Sometimes if you do have a formal diagnosis, it can be handy to share that with the assessor if you feel comfortable doing that. Very often diagnostic assessments contain lots of detailed information about your specific areas of challenge and strength, and that can really help an assessor sometimes. But again, typically speaking, the answer to do I need to bring anything is no. What happens after the assessment? Okay, so the assessor's job really starts after the assessment. The assessment itself is really a bit of a discovery exercise for the assessor. It's the assessor's chance to find out everything they need to find out about your situation. After the assessment, the assessor has to go away and start thinking about what sort of adjustments might support this individual. What sort of things can I suggest to support this person with the areas that they've talked about? And the assessor puts all of this information into a report. Writing reports is probably the part of my job that I find the most challenging. Report writing doesn't come naturally for me, and they take quite a lot of thinking about for me, but they are the important part of the needs assessment, because what that report does is tell you as the employee and your employer what sort of things they could be considering as reasonable adjustments. And they'll also explain why. So they'll give all the background as well. They won't just give recommendations. They'll explain what those recommendations are. If it's a piece of software, they'll explain what that software does. And they'll also explain what areas of your role that's going to support you with. So it's quite a detailed document and should contain all that type of information. Okay. And that report is usually then submitted into your to your organization, and then they will take that forward and they will look at those adjustments, those considerations, and they will decide, ideally with you, which ones of those you'd like to take forward. Hopefully that all makes sense. I'm just keeping an eye on the time. We're getting there. I've got just a couple more slides to go through. So the last question I've got on here is, if I feel like I would benefit from a workplace needs assessment, what should I do? Now, ideally, the first thing you should do, the first thing you should feel comfortable doing, is talking to your manager. Okay. And again, this goes back to, for an organization, the most challenging part of this whole process is creating an environment where someone feels safe enough to have these conversations. If we can have the conversation, everything after that becomes a lot easier. Okay, and hopefully, if you're an employee, you work in an environment where you do feel safe having these conversations. That being the case, talk to your manager. It's highly likely that your organisation will have processes and policies in place around reasonable adjustments and workplace needs assessments, and your manager will know of those, or at least your manager will know where to look and go for support of those. Failing that, your HR team, your people team, are usually a really good place to go for support around this. Another thing that you can look at is, are there any employee resource groups in your organisation? Typically, this sort of applies to larger organisations, but many larger organisations have lots of employee groups around things like disability, neurodifference, that type of thing. And very often these groups are great resources. Maybe your organisation has an EAP, an employee assistance program. You may have an occupational health provider or a healthcare provider. They can often be great sources of support as well. Also, we've got access to work. Access to work is employee-led, which means that you, as the employee, can apply to access to work entirely on your own. Okay, you do not need permission from your employer to do that. Access to work is really easy to find. All you've got to do is type access to work into any search engine, Google, Bing, or anything else, and it will pop right up at the top of the page. You can go through that process of application. Access to work make it quite straightforward and very user-friendly. So if your organisation doesn't have a process for adjustments and workplace assessments, you can always sort of visit access to work. Your organisation's process may actually involve and include going to access to work. Hopefully, that's helped untangle that workplace needs assessment question a little bit and not made it more tangled. But we've got a few minutes now, which I'm going to open up to questions and so and do my best to answer questions if I can get the words out. And I'm just going to sort of ask Donna to come in now. And have we got any questions, any comments in the chat?
Yes, we do. First of all,
wonderful.
Mark, thank you. My goodness, that was so insightful, taking us through step by step. You know, the impact of the report, the usefulness, what we should expect. Thank you so much. That was a brilliant conversation. So we do have a question here. So first question coming through, legally, what are the obligations of the employer to make or even consider adjustments? And to what extent is this enforceable? Assuring that the employer is able to sidestep, assuming, that makes more sense, assuming that the employer is able to sidestep their reasonable obligations, what evidence should be collected for presentation to, for example, a tribunal?
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to try to unpick that, but
Do you want me to re-ask it, Mark, in kind of step-by-step way? Because it's a great question, but there is
It
a
is
lot
a great
in there.
question. It sounds like a whole presentation on its own to answer that one. But yeah, no, that's okay. Let's unpick that a little bit first of all. So first of all, I'm going to preface this by saying that I cannot give you legal advice. Okay, but in terms of adjustments, an employer is governed by the Equality Act. And the Equality Act clearly states that the employer is obligated to make reasonable adjustments. And it does not put any parameters or conditions around that phrase. So there really aren't any adjustments that an employer doesn't have to think about or consider. Okay, an employee can ask for any type of adjustment for any part of their role. Okay. The question becomes around whether that adjustment is going to be considered reasonable or not. Right? Now that's very often, that's where solicitors make their money. Okay, it's in these grey areas and these words that we use around reasonable. All right, but using those 4 questions, those 4 filters, is a really good starting point for that reasonableness question. Okay, and there may be really good reasons why an organisation does believe something to be unreasonable. If an adjustment that has been either suggested or requested is deemed ultimately to be unreasonable, what recourse does an employee have around that? Usually, I'm going to take back the word usually. I'm going to say the right way of approaching that should be a conversation around why it's unreasonable, some explanations of the thinking around that, and an exploration of the alternatives. Okay, is there another way we can achieve the same outcome in a different way? Okay, that should be what happens. Okay, worst case scenario, the employee has recourse to the organisation's grievance procedure. You can raise a formal grievance, and the idea of a grievance is that somebody else in the organisation will also then examine the same question. Okay. None of this guarantees that you will have that adjustment put in place, but it does, as much as possible, make sure that it's looked at objectively and fairly. Did that answer the first part of that question, Donna?
Yes, it did very well, and I like the way you're doing it, Mark, because you're so wise, but you're also giving us a sense that this is step by step trying to figure out in the different contexts that we're asking these questions what the best fit is. And I think these are the types of conversations when we get asked this type of question that for people like us, we've got to figure out, right, what are we thinking of here? There isn't a lot of black and white, is there, on these
No,
subjects?
and that's the thing, and that's what makes it difficult and scary for people. It would be really easy if everything was black and white, but unfortunately, it would only fit a few people. There's a reason why it's grey and fuzzy. Um, but what's important is that there's a process and
Yeah.
that we do have a process to follow. Um, but what's even more important than that is that as people, we approach that process with, it's going to sound a little bit trite, but with a good heart, with kindness, okay?
Yeah.
Because ultimately, everyone is going to benefit from someone being able to be their best self at work, okay? And if by making a few adjustments we can do that, then it's a really sensible conversation to have. And ultimately, that's what it's about.
Yeah.
Sorry, what
Great
was the
work,
second
Mark.
part of that question,
Well,
Donna?
we've asked again then, what evidence should be collected for presentation to a tribunal or so on if the employer is trying to sidestep reasonable adjustments?
Um, Good question. And again, that sounds quite a legal question, which I'm a little bit reluctant to answer. But I would probably say if you're in that position, then obviously keep a written record of requests, of explanations, um, obviously emails and so on and so forth. But the employment tribunal, that they are pretty good at exploring the situations around these things. Okay, so they will take the time to get the employer's perspective and the employee's perspective, and they will look at all aspects of the role. Okay, but yes, these can be really difficult situations to handle. Okay, and they often happen at the end of quite a long, stressful, emotionally draining process that can drag on for months and months and months. And in my experience, very often could have been resolved quite simply a lot earlier if people just approached these conversations open-mindedly. But that's another thing. So yes, difficult situations in terms of what evidence to collect, as much as you can, quite frankly. Keep written records, keep copies of written correspondence. But ideally, it doesn't get that far. But I do realise that in the real world, it sometimes does. Okay.
Thanks, Mark. I think I'd just love to hear your thoughts because as you're answering this, I'm thinking about, organizations that are out there, like charities and so on, who can sometimes support folks. But again, it's not legal advice. But I'm wondering, do you see ACAS sometimes as a role here that folks can turn to if they've got these types of almost legal type questions?
Yeah, absolutely. ACAS is a fantastic resource. ACAS, for people who aren't familiar, is it's an organisation that will offer free employment legal advice for both employers and employees. Okay. Again, in my experience, organisations like ACAS tend not to get too involved in specific situations. They tend to offer more general guidance and advice, which sometimes is all that's needed. Okay. But my advice to anybody in this situation is realistically, we should be looking to find resolutions within our organisation as much as we can. And sometimes that can just require a bit of a stepping back from the situation, maybe involving some other departments. If it does get to this stage, then yes, talk to ACAS. But ultimately, as I've said before, employment tribunals are usually pretty good at sort of untangling these situations.
Thanks, Mark.
But I do feel sorry for anybody who finds themselves in that
Yeah, it's
situation
really
because it's
tough.
really unpleasant.
It is. And please know, if this is you listening to this session, please know that you're not on your own. Reach out to us as much as we can. We can try and offer you support and some words of wisdom from us here. This is why we do these broadcasts, essentially.
Mm.
Mark, can you talk me through, some of the positive impacts that you've seen somebody going on the workplace needs journey, having on them as getting it right for themselves, getting their neurodiversity supported in that way? Are you thinking of any recent examples you might be able to share of someone who's gone on that journey and it's really made a difference for them?
Yes, yeah, many. One recent one that springs to mind is that actually it was actually quite nice. One of the adjustments that the workplace needs assessment suggested was awareness training for this particular individual's team. Okay. And it went really, really well. This particular employee was in a relatively small team, but it was lovely because they felt safe enough to actually take part in the training, and they almost used this training as a way of explaining, of self-advocating, if you like. And it landed really, really well. And some of the comments and so on from the training were lovely. Colleagues were saying, I didn't realise, I understand why this happens now. And there were lots of comments around, crikey, I do that as well. I totally get where you're coming from now. That didn't make sense to me before. And that particular employee said that that has made a massive difference to them. They feel a lot more heard. So yeah, sometimes, as I said before, a workplace needs assessment is designed to help everybody make sure they're considering all of the adjustments. But very often, the adjustments are the easy part of this whole process. Sometimes the simplest of adjustments can make a massive difference. The challenge is having an organization, having an environment where people feel safe enough asking for support in the first place. That's the challenge.
Thank you, Mark. And thank you for the whole session. It's so insightful. And we know how important these conversations are. Thank you everyone who's listened, whether you're live or whether you're listening to the recording. We put these sessions together for all the reasons that we've been chatting about, because we know it can really help those of you on a real journey with your neurodivergent differences at the moment. Please keep in touch with us. We are here to support. I've got a date for your diary as well. On the 20th of November, so this is our next how-to conversation. We are with Dr. Deborah Leveroy, and she's talking about how to encourage the conversation. And we know that in that session, we're going to have a look at what we call disclosure, sharing of yourself, the importance of assessment and so on. And it fits really well, I think, with on the back of what Mark's been sharing today. So thank you, everyone. Please do keep in touch. We've got contact details here. Always happy to support our community. Thank you again, Mark. Can't say thank you enough to you. Brilliant
My
session.
pleasure. Really enjoyed it. I felt like I've thrown an awful lot of information at people now, but
No, it's honestly, it's brilliant. And you've got such a clarity of communication. It's wonderful. So thank you for taking us through that step by step. And thank you, everyone. Let's keep in touch. Let's keep talking. And thanks for your time. Until next time. Bye, everyone.
bye bye.